She noticed his hands before anything else. That was the detail she kept coming back to later. Alone in her office with the city lights going dark outside the window, and the video playing for the fourth time on her laptop. She had noticed his hands, and she had made a decision, and everything that followed had come from that. Rafe Coulter was 41 years old. He had arrived at the Prescott Hotel in Nashville at 6:47 in the evening, with a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt he'd pressed himself that morning, dark jeans that were clean and not much beyond that, and a pair of work boots that had seen enough actual use to look like it. He was 6 feet even, broad through the shoulders in the way that came from physical work rather than a gym. And he hadn't shaved since Monday because the week had gotten away from him, which was most weeks. His hands were what they were. Scarred at the knuckles, rough at the palm, permanently carrying the faint trace of engine grease that no amount of cleaning entirely removed. The hands of a man who worked with them. Walking next to him, 2 fingers wrapped inside her whole fist, was his daughter. Celia Coulter was 9 years old and was wearing a navy dress she'd chosen herself over her late mother's old cardigan, which Rafe had let her bring because she'd asked, and because it still carried something he didn't have a word for and wasn't ready to lose. She had a small rolling bag with a Tyrannosaurus Rex printed on both sides, inside of which was a library book about the Cretaceous extinction event, and a granola bar she'd packed as a contingency against what she'd described as the possibility that the food at the thing would be weird. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's habit of watching before speaking. The Prescott was the kind of hotel that charged for the experience of standing in it. The Hartwell Automotive Foundation had used its second-floor reception hall for 9 consecutive years, and the event tonight was the most attended in the Gala's history, because the centerpiece of the charity auction. The reason several collectors had flown in from out of state, the reason the trade publications had sent photographers, the reason the program's headline read what it read, was a 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona, chassis number 96YE21F, one of fewer than 20 verified surviving examples in original condition, which had spent the previous 14 months in a garage in Millhaven, Tennessee, being brought back to something that made people stop talking when they walked into the room where it sat. Rafe had restored it, himself with his own hands in a garage that did not have his name on the outside and did not need to. He had not explained any of this to Celia. He'd told her they were going to a car event and there would be dinner. The woman standing at the entrance to the second-floor reception was 35 years old, precise in her posture and her appearance, and in the particular authority she projected, which was the authority of someone who understood that every detail of an event like this reflected on the company whose logo was on her blazer. Her name was Victoria Strand, and she had been running operations at Hargrove Auction House for 3 years. After 4 years of learning the business from a mentor she had trusted completely and who had taught her everything she knew about how the auction world worked and who most people in the room were before she met them. She was holding a tablet. She was looking at it when Rafe and Celia arrived at the entrance, and she looked up. The pause lasted 2 seconds. Her eyes moved from his face to his jacket to his hands and back to his face. And whatever calculation was running beneath her expression arrived at a conclusion she didn't bother to fully conceal. "Good evening," she said. The warmth had a ceiling. "Evening," Rafe said. "Rafe Coulter. I'm on the VIP list." She looked at the tablet. Her finger scrolled with the particular deliberateness of someone hoping not to find something. And then she found it, and she looked up. "You're Mr. Coulter." It wasn't quite a question. "That's right." Her expression did not change in any way that could be pointed at directly. "I'll need to see identification. We're verifying all VIP guests personally this evening." Rafe handed over his license without comment. She looked at it for longer than the information required, going between the photo and his face twice in a way that read as searching rather than confirming, and handed it back. Her eyes moved to Celia, "Your guest." "My daughter," Rafe said. "She's registered as my +1. That was confirmed in writing with your office 3 weeks ago." Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'll need to verify that with our coordinator." Celia was watching Victoria with the frank, steady attention she gave to things that confused her. "You can call Joanna Ferris," Rafe said. His voice was still even. She handled the coordination on our side. She has every email. He offered his phone. She can pull up the written confirmation in about 90 seconds. Victoria did not take the phone. That won't be necessary just yet. I'm going to ask you to wait here while I confirm with the team inside. Rafe looked at her for a moment. Our window opens at 6, he said. It's 6:52. This will only take a few minutes. He looked at her for a moment longer, not with anger, because he was very deliberately not doing that, but with the careful attention of someone making sure they understand what they're looking at. Then he said, "All right." And he stepped to the side, and Celia stepped with him, and they waited. Celia looked up at him. "Can't we go in?" "She's checking something." "She checked your license." "Something else." Celia thought about that. Then, what is she looking for? Rafe was watching Victoria speak quietly to someone just inside the reception door, her back to them, her posture tight. One of the other event staff caught Rafe's eye and looked away immediately. "A reason," he said. "For what?" "For the decision she already made." Celia turned this over the way she turned things over, with her whole face. "That's dumb." "People do dumb things sometimes," Rafe said. "Doesn't mean they're bad people." "Are you mad?" He considered it honestly. "A little," he said. "But angry doesn't do much right now." Celia accepted this. She reached into the rolling bag, pulled out her library book, and opened it to the page about the Chicxulub impact, and stood next to her father reading about mass extinction, while he waited in the marble corridor of a hotel whose gala had been built entirely around his work. What Victoria did not mention in the call she made at 7 o'clock to the lobby security desk, and what the two security officers who appeared at the reception entrance 8 minutes later made clear they had been given the impression of, was that there was a credentialing issue with an unverified guest attempting to access the restricted area. What she did not say, and what was also true, was that Rafe's documentation was complete and correct, that his +1 registration was on file, exactly as he'd described, and that the call had been made not because there was a genuine discrepancy, but because she had not yet found a way to resolve the gap between the man in front of her and the name on her list. The security officers were professional and visibly uncertain about what they'd been asked to do. Rafe had sat down on a corridor bench when the wait extended past 5 minutes. He stood when the officers came in, unhurried, and he kept his hands visible and his posture open. "I think this can be sorted out quickly," he said. "The most direct way is to call Joanna Ferris. She's coordinated with your team for 6 weeks. He held out his phone. "She can have the full documentation up in under 2 minutes. The first officer looked at Victoria. Victoria's face had gone carefully still. "Ma'am," the officer said, "do you have documentation of a credentialing concern?" The silence that followed lasted long enough to mean something. "There was a verification question," Victoria said, "which appears to have been," she paused, "addressed." "Not entirely," Rafe said. "I'd still like that call made if that's all right." It took 7 minutes. Joanna Ferris, who had been at her hotel 3 blocks away since 6:30 and who had been watching her phone with increasing directness for the past 40 minutes, arrived in person 4 minutes after the officers reached her. She was 47, 5'4", and she carried the particular authority of someone who had spent 18 years being the most prepared person in any room she walked into, and had learned to make that clear when it was necessary. She set Rafe's documentation on the corridor side table in under 2 minutes, the Hartwell Foundation VIP confirmation, the Hargrove auction house correspondence, the +1 registration dated to March, the restoration contract, all of it. "Are we done?" she said to the room. The corridor was quiet. Victoria was not looking at the papers. She was looking at Rafe, who was standing in his flannel shirt with Celia's library book tucked under one arm because Celia had handed it to him when Joanna came in, watching everything with the calm of a man who had known from the beginning exactly how this was going to resolve, and had chosen not to perform anything about it. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a speech. He had waited. There was an audience. There had been one since 7:03, when a retired press operator named Gus Witten, who had been attending the Hartwell Gala since the 4th year it ran, and who had arrived early specifically to see the Daytona before the crowd got to it. had walked out of the reception looking for the elevator, and had instead found a man in work clothes being held at the door of an event he'd built. Gus had filmed his fair share of things in 64 years. He filmed this one because it felt wrong in a way he trusted, and he'd learned that when something felt wrong, you documented it. His granddaughter had told him to post it when she saw it that evening. He'd argued with her for 2 hours. She was 22, and she was right, and eventually he had posted it with a caption that read, "This man built the car everyone's here to see tonight. His daughter was with him. Make of it what you will." No hashtags, no framing, he wasn't that kind of person. Victoria let the silence go as long as she could. Then she said, "We're done," flat and careful, the voice of someone who hasn't finished deciding whether they owe anything. The officers cleared. Joanna gave Rafe a look that carried a full paragraph and went inside. Rafe said, "Victoria." She looked at him. "I'm not going to make a scene," he said. "I don't want that in front of my daughter." A pause. "But I need one thing from you." She waited. "Apologize to Celia," he said, "not to me, to her." Something crossed Victoria's face. It was complicated, the particular complexity of an emotion with several layers, none of them easy. She turned toward Celia, who had taken her book back and was watching Victoria with those dark, patient eyes. "I'm sorry," Victoria said. Her voice wasn't steady. "I made a decision about you and your dad before I had any reason to. That wasn't fair. I'm sorry I did it." Celia looked at her for a moment. "Okay," she said then. "Is the car in there?" Something moved across Victoria's face that was almost a smile but wasn't sure it had been earned. "It is," she said. "Right inside." "Does it have the big wing?" "The biggest." Celia appeared to find this an adequate resolution. She tucked her book under her arm and walked through the reception entrance without looking back. Gus Whitten posted the video at 11:41 that night. By 2 in the morning, it had 6 million views. By the time Rafe's phone started going off the next morning at 6:50, while he was in the kitchen measuring coffee, it had passed 34 million. He stood on the back porch in the October cold and read through it. The clip that was being shared most was not the moment Joanna set the documentation down. It was the moment at the end, the 20 seconds, where Rafe asked Victoria to apologize to his daughter. Not to him. To her. He called Joanna at 7:15. "How bad is it?" "The video itself isn't the problem," Joanna said. "The problem is what it's standing in for. Every person who's ever been sized up before they got to speak is watching it." "Randall?" Called at 6:45. "He's seen it. He wants to talk." Rafe looked at the backyard. The oak near the fence was dropping leaves steadily. He'd been meaning to check on that branch for 3 weeks. "Set it up," he said. "And before I decide anything, I want to see what Victoria Strand does." Joanna was quiet for a moment. "She's taking significant heat." "That doesn't tell me who she is," Rafe said. "Wait and see." He went inside to finish making breakfast. Victoria spent the day watching the video with the particular attention of someone studying something they were in and wished they could examine from outside their own body. She watched herself look at Rafe. She watched the expression that moved across her face, the assessment, the decision, the result of the math running under the surface, and she recognized it. She had made that expression before in other rooms, in other corridors, without knowing she was making it. It had not occurred to her to look at it closely until now. She found in the comment section a high school automotive teacher in Memphis named Warren Delacroix who had written without anger that he recognized in her something he had recognized in himself 15 years ago and had spent the years since then trying to change. He said he wasn't sure he'd managed it entirely. He said the distance between the reflex and the choice got smaller. He said that was the most honest thing he had to offer. Victoria read it 5 times. She wrote her statement herself, over 6 hours, and deleted the parts that were still trying to protect her, rather than account for what she'd done, and rewrote them, and deleted them again, and wrote something more honest in their place. It went up under her personal name on Sunday morning, and said, among other things, that she had looked at Rafe Coulter in 2 seconds and made a decision that she was not able to call accidental, because it had felt like a reflex, and a reflex is something that lives in you. And she intended to examine what was living in her. It said that Celia had done nothing to deserve being treated like an obstacle in a space her father had earned. It used the word bias, where a previous draft had used the word mistake, because a mistake sounds like an accident and her choices had not been accidents. They had been fast and unexamined, and she intended to examine them now. What the statement did not mention was what she had spent Saturday investigating after her operations manager had flagged an irregularity in the event staffing records. It did not mention the Hargrove scheduling coordinator whose assignment had been quietly redirected Friday evening, ensuring that the VIP greeter originally assigned to Rafa's arrival was elsewhere when he arrived. It did not mention the payment records that her operations director had spent Saturday tracing through a consulting intermediary to a competing restoration business that had lost the Daytona contract to Rafe 14 months earlier and had not been graceful about the loss. Her lawyers had told her to hold that information. For once, she agreed with them. But she also made a call that Saturday evening that her lawyers had not suggested. Rafe picked up on the second ring. Rafe here. It's Victoria Strand. A short pause. I know, he said. I have 2 reasons for calling, she said. She had decided not to build up to it. She'd spent enough of the last 48 hours building up to things. One is personal. The other is something I think you need to know. Go ahead. The personal one first. She had written this part down and then put the paper away because she didn't want to read it. I want to say something directly to you that I couldn't fit into a public statement. I'm sorry for what happened to Celia. Not as a position. As a person who looked at your daughter and treated her like she was a problem to be managed, when she was a child sitting next to her father in a hallway she had every right to be in. I've thought about that every day since Friday night. Not in a reputation management way. In an actual human way. The silence on Rafe's end lasted long enough that she almost filled it. I hear you, he said. His voice was careful but not closed. The second reason. She told him everything. The staffing redirect, the consulting payments, the losing bid from 14 months ago, the financial trail her operations director had pulled. She talked for 8 minutes without interruption. When she finished, the quiet on his end lasted long enough to be a different kind of silence than the first. You're telling me this, he said, before you talked to your lawyers about whether to. Yes. Why? She had thought about that question for most of the previous day. The answer she'd arrived at was not complicated, even if it had taken her a long time to reach it. Because you're the one who got hurt, she said. You and Celia. And whatever's being done to you doesn't stop unless you know it's happening. She paused. And because I was used to do it, which means I have some responsibility for making it right. He was quiet again. Can you send what you have, he said. Already prepared to. Joanna's secure line? That's right. A pause. Victoria. The way he said it was not warm, but it was not closed either. This is going to make things harder for you. If whoever arranged this finds out you handed this over. I know, she said. All right, he said. Thank you. She set down the phone and noticed that her hands were not entirely steady, and she thought that was probably correct, and she didn't try to do anything about it. What Joanna's investigator, working from Victoria's documentation and his own parallel research, assembled over the following 3 weeks was a picture of considerable patience. The competing business was Vo Restoration Group, run by a man named Sterling Vo out of Atlanta, who had spent the previous 14 months constructing a quiet mechanism designed to produce a public confrontation involving Rafe Coulter at the highest visibility event of Rafe's professional year. The mechanism had required 2 things: a contact inside Hargrove's event operations who could redirect the staffing at the right moment, and someone in authority at that event who would look at Rafe Coulter and make the decision Victoria had made in 2 seconds. Vo had selected Victoria with care. He had read the profile on her, the inherited authority, the years under a mentor, the particular way she had been trained to assess events and guests before they spoke. He had understood something about her that she had not yet understood about herself, and he had positioned her accordingly. He had also been wrong about one thing. Joanna explained it to Rafe on a Wednesday evening with the investigation summary spread across the garage office desk. He built the whole thing on an assumption, she said, The confrontation only works if it becomes a scandal. And a scandal requires you to give people something scandalous. She paused. He figured that a man who looks the way you look, being treated the way you were treated, in front of that many people, he'd explode. Rafe looked at the papers. He bet on my hands, he said. What? He figured my hands would tell the story before I got a chance to. Rafe was quiet for a moment. He lost that bet. He lost it, Joanna said, because you stood in that corridor for 19 minutes and didn't raise your voice. Rafe looked out the office window at the Millhaven evening coming down in its usual way. Slow and orange and cool, the kind of fall dusk that didn't call attention to itself. He had a car on the lift that needed its exhaust looked at. He had 2 more scheduled for the week. He had a foundation partnership agreement that Randall Kemp had signed the previous month in a conference room in Nashville, with no ceremony and no champagne, which was how Randall preferred to do things, and which Rafe had found he respected considerably. Make sure Victoria's cooperation is in the record, he said. Whatever happens to Vo legally, and I'm not involved in that, I want her cooperation documented. Joanna wrote it down. The Coulter Restoration Labs program launched its first cohort the following March. 16 students at 4 community colleges across Tennessee, learning restoration work not from a textbook, but from working on actual vehicles alongside actual practitioners, including Rafe, who drove to 2 of the sites every other week and worked beside the students in the way the program required. He had thought about doing something like this since the year after his wife died, when he had left the engineering division and driven Celia back to Millhaven in a pickup with everything they owned, and had understood that what he'd been building for 12 years, the career, the salary, the version of himself that required a badge and a glass office, was not what he was going to build for the next 12. He had thought about it for 3 years. He had not done it. There was always a reason that felt reasonable. October at the Prescott Hotel had made him impatient with reasonable. The launch was held at the Millhaven Community Center. Rafe's choice over the suggestions of 2 board members who had thought Nashville would project better. 130 people, the first cohort in the front rows. No press, no teleprompter, no catering budget that exceeded the program budget. Rafe's remarks were 11 minutes long. He had written them himself and cut the parts that sounded like speeches until what remained was closer to what he would actually say. Celia walked onto the stage in the middle of them. She had been sitting in the 3rd row with Joanna and had apparently arrived at a question she felt couldn't wait. She crossed the stage, stopped next to him at the microphone, looked up. Dad. Into the microphone, because he was still holding it. Yeah. Why didn't you get mad at the hotel? The room had gone very quiet. Rafe looked at his daughter, the old cardigan over the navy dress, the dark eyes that had sat in that corridor and watched things and said nothing, and then asked exactly the right question 3 months later. Because I was looking at you, he said. What do you mean? I looked at you and decided what I needed you to see. He paused. Anger's real. It's fast, but it's loud, and loud doesn't hold. Dignity's quieter. It sticks around longer. Celia thought about that with her full face. Did you feel dignified? Not really, he said. I felt tired and a little mad, and I wanted to leave, but I acted dignified, and that part you can always control. She processed this. Okay, she said, and then, is dinner after this? Yes. Good. She turned and walked back down the steps to her seat, unhurried, as though the exchange had been a scheduled item she had completed to her satisfaction. Somebody started clapping, and then everybody did. Victoria was in the 8th row. She had called Joanna 2 weeks before and asked, without framing it as anything other than what it was, whether it would be appropriate for her to come. Joanna had asked and called back the same evening and said yes. She sat in a dark blazer with her hair down and watched. She watched Rafe talk about what it meant to be measured against the wrong things. She watched him talk briefly about his wife, which felt private even from a distance, and she looked at her hands for a moment. She watched Celia walk onto the stage and heard the question, "Why didn't you get mad?" And she heard both answers. The honest one. I felt tired and a little mad, and I wanted to leave, but I acted dignified, and that part you can always control. She had not expected him to say that. She had expected the version of him that the internet had assembled. The man who had simply stood in that corridor in a state of perfect calm, who had chosen dignity because that was what he was constitutionally without it costing him anything. But that was not what he said. He said the feeling was there. He said he wanted to leave. He said dignity was the choice, not the character trait. That was the version that was useful. You could not replicate a feeling you didn't have. You could choose how you moved inside the feelings you were having. Victoria had spent 5 months examining the 2 seconds in the corridor, not comfortably, but steadily. She was catching the reflex earlier than she had been. The distance between it and the choice was getting smaller. She didn't know if it would ever close entirely, and she thought the more honest answer was probably that it wouldn't, and that the work was in the distance getting smaller and staying smaller, and that this was not a finished state but a continuing one, which was harder than a finished state and also more honest. At the end of Rafe's remarks, he mentioned briefly that the program had launched at full capacity from day one because of a founding contribution from someone who had asked not to be named, someone who had, in his words, made a call they regretted and decided that regret wasn't the right place to stop. He did not look toward the 8th row. He didn't need to. Victoria looked at the stage and felt something that was not redemption, because redemption implied a conclusion. And she was not concluded. She was going to be working on this for a long time. What she felt was more specific than that. The sensation of having stepped across something she'd been afraid to step across, and finding that the ground on the other side held. Afterward, she waited, talking to a vocational coordinator from one of the partner colleges, until Rafe found her near the side exit 20 minutes later, in the way of someone who had seen a person across a room and decided to go say something directly. He looked tired, the structural, ongoing kind of tired that came from running without margins. "You came," he said. "I did." She paused. "Thank you for the yes." He looked at her for a moment. "The contribution mattered," he said, "from day one." "It was the right place for it," she said. He almost smiled, just barely. "Yeah." They stood for a moment in the particular way of two people who have been through something significant without having chosen to go through it together, which creates a kind of specific, unexplained connection. Celia appeared from somewhere to his left. She looked at Victoria with the same frank, patient gaze she'd had in the corridor 5 months ago. "You're the hotel lady," she said. "Yes," Victoria said, "I am." "You said sorry." "I did." Celia looked at her steadily. "Are you better now at not doing that?" Victoria took a breath to meet it, not because it was harsh, because it was exactly the right question. The only one that actually mattered once everything else was set aside. "I'm working on it," she said. "I think so, but I won't know for a while." Celia nodded once. "Okay," she said, and looked at Rafe. "Can we get the pasta thing?" "Go ahead," he said. She turned and disappeared into the crowd. Rafe watched the space she'd left. "She asked me," he said, "a couple weeks after it happened, whether you were a bad person." Victoria looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said you were a person who made a bad call," he said, "and that those are different things." He said it as a fact, because it was one, without any theater around it. "Thank you," Victoria said, "for telling her that." It was true, he said, simply, the way he said everything. They stood at the exit a few minutes later. Rafe had his keys and his jacket and Celia's T-Rex bag over one shoulder. "For what it's worth," he said, "the last 5 months have been visible. What you've been doing." She looked at him. She understood he didn't mean it as a transactional compliment. He meant it because it was accurate, and because he thought accurate things deserved to be said. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went back inside. Victoria stood at the top of the community center steps and let the March air come in. Cool and with something in it that felt like a direction rather than a condition, the kind of cold that was going somewhere rather than just sitting. The parking lot was full of the ordinary shapes of a small-town Thursday evening. None of it looked like the location of anything significant. That was the thing about significant things. They never happened in places that looked designed for them. They happened in hotel corridors and back porches and community centers with folding chairs and one decent speaker system in the ordinary moments where someone chose what to do next, and the choice mattered more than it looked like it would. She walked down the steps. Inside, Celia had found the pasta and was eating it with the focused satisfaction of someone who had packed a backup granola bar and was glad she hadn't needed it. Rafe stood next to her and looked at the room. The first cohort students now dispersed through the space, talking with mentors and engineers and program coordinators. The particular energy of people beginning something together in a room that had not contained this collection of possibilities the week before. "Dad," Celia said. "Yeah." "Was tonight good?" He looked at the room once more. 16 people in those front rows whose circumstances had intersected tonight with something that had not existed for them before, because a door had opened at a particular moment that had been a long time coming. "Yeah," he said. "Tonight was good." "Me too." She finished her plate and set it down with the finality of someone who had evaluated the evidence and reached a settled conclusion. "Can we come back?" "That's what the program is," he said. "Every other week." She appeared to do the math. "Good," she said. "I want to see the cars." He took her hand, and they walked toward the exit. The room continued around them, full of conversations that had not existed before tonight and that would, in the slow and unannounced way that real things develop, become something more over time. Introductions and plans and the specific quiet change in the circumstances of people who had needed exactly this particular door to open. Outside, the Tennessee night was clear and very still, and the stars were visible in the way they got visible outside the city, without competition, without anything else asking for your attention. Celia stopped on the top step and looked up. "You can actually see them out here," she said. "Different from the city," Rafe said. She looked at them for a moment, with the full seriousness she brought to Cretaceous extinctions and rear-wing aerodynamics, and questions about why her father hadn't gotten mad. Then she looked up at him. "Breakfast tomorrow?" He looked down at her. The old cardigan, the rolling bag with the Tyrannosaurus, the dark eyes that missed very little, and that had sat in a hotel corridor 9 months ago, watching a grown woman make a series of decisions that a 9-year-old had clocked clearly from the start. "Yeah," he said. "Breakfast tomorrow." They walked to the truck together, her hand in his, and the night held them the way nights do. Without ceremony or scorekeeping, without any awareness of what the previous 5 months had asked of the man walking through it, which was the only kind of ending that was ever actually real.